going to record that. Okay. Okay. All right. So thank you again. Just again, thank you for joining us. My name is Alana McGilpin from the Jewish Community Foundation. I staff our Young Professionals Giving Circle, JewGood Hartford, which is the sponsor for the program today. I wanted to introduce our speakers this afternoon real quick, and then we'll get this started. Rachel Donnell. Rachel's mother, father, and all of her aunts and uncles were Holocaust survivors from Poland. Renia Finder is her mother's first cousin. Her mother survived Auschwitz concentration camp, and her father survived Majdanek. Rachel was born in the Bronx. She enjoyed teaching special education for more than 30 years in New York and Connecticut, and seizes every opportunity possible to speak to Jewish and non-Jewish groups about the Holocaust and its important lessons. Rachel went to Poland with her cousins to see where her family was before and during the war. She has 3 children and 4 grandchildren, all who value and continue to practice Judaism. She's now retired, living in Connecticut with her husband and 1 cat. Okay. Devorah is the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors, proud of her Jewish heritage. Devorah has been reading High Holiday Torah since her bat mitzvah. She was raised in Connecticut and is the youngest of Rachel Donnell's 3 children. She attended UConn undergraduate, UConn School of Medicine, and Tufts Family Medicine residency. She is a family medicine physician in Connecticut who is passionate about advocating for her patients. Devorah founded the UConn Pre-Medical Society, and since 2012 has been involved with a primary care advocacy and leadership organization. Devorah is on the JewGood Hartford committee and is honored to be part of today's events. So Devorah and Rachel, take it away.
Hi.
Thank you very much. Excellent. All right, it is an honor to be here with you all today. So first off, I want to encourage you all to try to have your videos on so that way we can feel more like we're in person, seeing each other's faces. All right. I also want to thank all of our sponsors. So the Piaker Family Fund, the Jewish Community Foundation of Greater Hartford, Voices of Hope, JNext from the Mandel JCC, Congregation Beth Israel, the Tribe, Jewish Federation of Greater Hartford Emerging Leadership Division, and the Jewish Federation of Greater New Haven, J-Haven. This program is presented by JewGood Hartford, which is from the Jewish Community Foundation of Greater Hartford. JewGood is a giving circle, which is aimed to empower young professionals of all backgrounds who feel or want to feel part of a Jewish community, so that way we can engage in philanthropy and make a difference in the world. Basically, as a giving circle, what that means is that we all contribute time and money, which goes into a pooled fund. And then together, we can use that to make an even more of a difference by selecting a local nonprofit organization that receives a grant. With recent recipients having been the Connecticut Coalition to End Homelessness, which has gotten actually housing for 10 families from a grant, as well as Compass Youth Collaborative's Junior Peace Buildings program to support youth at high risk of violence. So through social, educational, and volunteer events, members can build connections with other young philanthropists and the community through JewGood. So diving into today's program, feel free to jot down notes to yourself about any questions, because at the end, we are going to have some open time for questions and some discussion. We had planned today to have my Aunt Renia here with us today, who's a Schindler's List survivor. But unfortunately, Renia is not feeling well, so she won't be able to be with us today. As Holocaust survivors are aging, more and more it is important for the children and grandchildren of survivors like my mother and I to share their experiences. And it's imperative that each and every one of us and each and every one of you continue to tell these stories about what happened during the Holocaust so it is never forgotten. Thankfully, Renia has been teaching about her experiences for the past 40 years, since 1980. So we have many videos and recordings of her presentations, some of which we're going to be using today for this presentation. And she also recorded some videos from her home specifically for today, which we will be showing as well. As Renia has said, as survivors are getting older, in a few more years, there won't be any survivors left. So it is essential that we share the stories of the Holocaust with the younger generations. I'm the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors, and my mom's whole side of the family, including Renia, are Holocaust survivors from Poland. Growing up, I always knew about the Holocaust, and I understood that, as my grandmother's sister said, hate just grows and grows like a volcano until one day it erupts. Growing up, there was also one additional four-letter word that was frowned upon, that we never used: hate. On the spectrum of dislike, it's being so far to the extreme of hatred, especially when it's about someone, is so dangerous. So we are always taught never to use the word hate. And one of my relatives who's always emphasized this lesson is Renia. My Aunt Renia grew up as an only child in Krakow, in a happy, loving home with a normal childhood. She lived across the street from a river, skating in the winter and swimming in the summer. Her mother was one of 7 siblings, and her father was one of 8 brothers. One of those brothers was my grandma's dad. She had a lot of cousins, including my grandma, and Renia always had someone to play with. As a child, she heard her parents talk about anti-Semitism and what was happening in Germany. She encountered anti-Semitism markedly in kindergarten, when another kindergartner actually threw a rock at her and called her dirty Jew. Afterwards, she recalls being confused, going home and crying to her mother because she had showered. Then her life changed significantly on September 1st, 1939, at age 10, when Germany invaded Poland.
Hi, I'd like to talk to you about what happened in 1939 when life changed for my family and the Jewish people in Europe. When Renia or I speak about the Holocaust, it is not just to share the horrible experiences and their suffering, but more importantly, it's to teach crucial lessons that can apply today and in the future as well. As I grew up with both my parents being Holocaust survivors, I knew that there was nothing I could do to take away the pain that they had suffered. But I knew that what I wanted to do was to share their experiences and make sure people knew about the Holocaust. My mother and father both lost their parents, which meant I had no grandparents. I didn't even realize that people had grandparents until I went to school and heard other kids talking about them. There were 5 children in my mom's family. When the war started, their ages ranged from 7 years old to 17. There were 4 sisters and a little brother. My mom was 16 years old when the war started. Unfortunately, my parents and Renia suffered a lot due to the hatred, prejudice, and scapegoating in the world at that time. Renia is not only my mother's first cousin. Renia also spent the first few years of the Holocaust with my mother. I remember when Renia told me that she actually shared a bed with my mom when they were both in Plaszow concentration camp. Renia's book over here, Renia's book, My Survival, A Girl on Schindler's List, tells us what happens when prejudice is allowed to breed hatred and inhumanity. Renia's book describes how the Nazis were able to murder millions of Jewish people. And I'd like to read some quotes from you so you can actually hear them in her own words. The German army occupied my town, Krakow, in the first week of September 1939. They marched through the city in parade fashion, their boots pounding on the pavement while tanks rolled down the streets and shook the ground like an earthquake. Hitler hated Jews. We had known that for some time already. But now, his troops, his Nazi troops, occupied our city, and my father and his brothers gathered in our apartment to discuss what to do. Surely they agreed the Germans wouldn't harm women and children. It was the men who were in danger. Don't worry, they told us. The German invasion won't last long, and soon we will all be together again. No one could imagine what was going to happen. Jews had been attacked before, but on a much smaller scale. In Renia's words, overnight, she went from being a little girl to becoming an enemy of the state. My only crime was being Jewish. The situation for the Jewish people in Poland got worse and worse and worse. Renia was 10 years old, and she remembers many restrictive laws that were passed. Jewish children were not allowed to go to school. Jews were no longer allowed to use public transportation. They were even forbidden to walk on the sidewalks and had to walk in the gutter. Jews had their shops, the shops that they owned, were taken over by other people. Their families' bank accounts were frozen. They had no source of income and no access to savings. And then other laws were also passed, laws that forbade the Polish people from doing business with the Jewish people, so they couldn't even buy groceries. Life was getting really difficult. In 1940, Renia, her family, and my mother's family were forced into the Krakow Ghetto by gunpoint. They were told they would be safe and out of the way of the fighting. Well, they thought they would be returning to their home soon, but the real reason was Hitler's final solution to kill all the Jewish people. You have to think about the fact that communication was different back then. Today, we have so much access to knowing what's going on all around the world. But back then, all they had was the radio, and the radio was controlled by Hitler and his German people. So they really didn't know what was going to happen. My mom told me that when they were taken to the ghetto, she saw her neighbors and the kids that she went to school with watching behind the curtains as she was taken away, and she felt really hurt. Renia recalls that when she was walking to the Krakow Ghetto, there were people who were throwing stones and shouting, "Good riddance, Jews." The ghetto was a series of streets, contained 320 apartment buildings. These buildings had originally housed 3,000 people. Then the Germans took those residents elsewhere and put in 16,000 Jewish people to live in that same space. There was disease and starvation. They were only given some watery soup and maybe some bread to eat. There was a 10-foot brick wall that was built around the ghetto, and they were surrounded by the people with guns. Every moment in the ghetto was dangerous. So I'd like to quote from Renia's book. We saw death every day in the Krakow Ghetto. My father had a good friend named Ruddy. They asked to play cards together. One day, my father came home with an ashen face. He told us that he and Rudy had been standing in front of the ghetto hospital when a German officer walked by, fired his gun, and killed Rudy. The German had no reason to kill Rudy other than because he was Jewish. Many Jews did not survive living in the ghetto. Sometimes people ask, why didn't the Jewish people try to escape? Well, how could they really? Think about it. These were families. And where would they go? Who was going to take them? Neighbors? Other countries? They had previously experienced anti-Semitism. There were pogroms before in which Jews were attacked, but then things would be over soon. And that's what they thought would happen again. Unfortunately, that wasn't going to happen. Not like that. After the ghetto, Renia and her mom, and my mom and her 4 sisters were sent to Plaszow concentration camp. It was a struggle to stay alive in Plaszow. As Renia wrote in her book, I'd like to have it in her own words. So I like to use the book. Okay. One page over. Here we are. We were always hungry in the Plaszow camp. Hungry, as people understand that word today, is different from hungry in a concentration camp. Hungry in a camp meant a twisting, painful sensation in your stomach that made you dizzy and weak and never went away. Our hope is that there would be enough food to keep us alive until the next morning. Our food was also not food, as most people understand that word. Food in a concentration camp meant a foul-smelling bowl of watery soup and a piece of stale bread. Throughout the day, we were always looking for something more to eat. Guards stood by the garbage piles outside the inmate kitchen and shot any desperately hungry prisoner who even dared to dig through the garbage for scraps. When I asked Renia a while ago, why don't I hear people talk more about being cold? I hear people talk about being hungry in concentration camp. And her answer to me then was, because hunger doesn't go away. And now we have a video with Renia speaking.
How many have you all seen the movie Schindler's List? Because if you have, I want you to know that the movie was almost a documentary. Because everything in that movie was exactly the way things happened. It happened to me. That was my life. When I went to see that movie, I felt like I left my seat and went into the movie and lived all of it all over again. And in that movie, you would also, for those of you who saw the movie, and for those of you who didn't, I hope you will, well, there's a scene in that movie where an limousine comes bringing in all kinds of high-ranking generals. One of them, whose name was Amon Get, was going to be in charge of liquidating the ghetto and establishing a concentration camp outside of the Krakow Ghetto, about 7 kilometers. And I remember that so well because people were saying that Amon Get is from Vienna. And of course, we were still so naive and we felt, well, the Viennese people, they are so cultured, he's gonna be better, he will be more human. Amon Get was the most sadistic murderer that ever lived. Amon Get was a man who enjoyed killing. Amon Get had a villa right at the camp Plaszów. It was built on the little village called Plaszów. There were 3 Jewish cemeteries there. And when they started to build the camp, when they started to build the barracks, they had, of course, to erase the cemetery. And you can imagine what happens when you do that. We had little tombstones. The men were building the barracks, and the women, all the women from the ghetto were sent to build the road from the broken tombstones. Now, wherever you go nowadays, you see a lot of construction. So you know what it takes to build a road, all kinds of machines. Can you imagine women sitting on the ground trying to put together a road from the broken tombstones? It was impossible. Couldn't do that. So Amon Get would stand on the veranda of his villa every morning, and when the people were going to work at 6 o'clock in the morning, he would just stay there and watch, and he would just go hunting. But Amon Get was not hunting for animals. He was hunting for people. So you never knew, wherever you were, when the next shot would come from. I remember sitting in that line. The women were sitting a long, mile-long line of women sitting, trying to figure out how to build a road. And Amon Get, when he got tired of standing on his veranda, he would come down, he would walk behind us. He had a dog, a big dog. I never saw a dog like that in the United States or ever. It was a big white dog with the black polka dots on it. We always call it polka dots, but the dog was huge, not like a Dalmatian. And the dog's name was Rolf. And when Amonget came by and he stood by you, and if you didn't say, "Good morning, Sir Rolf," to the dog, he would shoot. I remember how scary it was, and to this day, I'm afraid of big dogs. And I remember especially that one day when I was sitting next to my mom on one side, and on the other side, my friend Stella. Now, her parents and her brother were taken away very early because her brother had muscular dystrophy, and he was considered even worse because he was physically handicapped, and they took those people first. And I remember that all of a sudden, my friend Stella fell over. And I put my hand behind her and I whispered, sit up, because I hear Amonget. And I tried to pick her up, and then I realized that she was dead, that he had shot her, but she was sitting right next to me, and I didn't hear her. I didn't hear it. I didn't know. When finally,
Well, yeah. Ranger told me about Amonget. She told me how he would ride his horse and how she was afraid when he came near her. When Amonget came near her, she didn't know whether to look at him, look at his horse, look down at the ground. Sometimes he would shoot someone just for not looking at his horse. He gave so much value to his horse, however, not value of any sort to the Jewish people there. My mom sewed for Amonget for his wife, probably more likely like his mistress. So she was able to get some extra bread. When she went back to the barracks with the extra bread, though, the Nazis accused her of stealing it. So many times she was hit over the head. Well, later, when she developed Alzheimer's at age 60, we often wondered and attributed that maybe it was all those head injuries during the Holocaust. Then when she was caught with material for sewing, she was also accused of stealing. So they had her kneel on the corner of the barracks on sharp stones and stay there all day. Her knees were hurt so badly that later, I remember as a child, when my mom couldn't even go upstairs because her knees hurt so bad, at nighttime we had to bring her mattress downstairs. In my mother's own way, she was trying to show some resistance to the Nazis' war effort. She was supposed to sew Nazis' raincoats. Well, she had to keep busy sewing, but her form of resistance was she would only sew right sleeves. Well, there was also a lot of resistance on a larger scale also. For instance, the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. They actually kept the Nazis out of the Warsaw Ghetto for 60 days. I actually knew someone who was a survivor of the Warsaw Ghetto, an amazing woman. One of the other acts of resistance was at the Sobibor concentration camp. And one of the survivors of that resistance actually lived in Connecticut. In 1943, Ranger's mother heard about Oskar Schindler and how he was planning to get some Jewish prisoners to work in his factory. So Ranger went over to the man who was making that list and begged him to please put her and her mother on that list. And luckily, because the man had known Ranger from the ghetto, he put her name on the list and her mother's name on the list. By show of hands, who has seen Schindler's List? Wonderful. I'm really glad. I really hope you get to see it. Wonderful, wonderful. Ranger always said, just like she did in the video a second ago, that it was actually just the way it happened. The movie was very accurate. So Ranger was working in Schindler's factory, the ammunition factory. She was doing on the ammunition, the factory had a little machine where she had to take care of the small bullet shells. That was her job. Now, even though Schindler was a Nazi businessman and, you know, he wore the diamond Nazi symbol on his lapel, but he also was a kind man with a good heart, and he cared about the Jewish people, and he made Renia feel safe. And we're going to show you a video of her speaking.
What Oskar Schindler wanted when he opened the factory and was to become rich. That was his ambition. He wanted to have enough money to buy expensive clothes, expensive cars, expensive horses. Before all that, he was selling farm equipment. So he traveled to Krakow quite a lot. He traveled all over, but he wasn't making much money. And he didn't have a very happy marriage. He married somebody very much unlike him. Mrs. Schindler was a very quiet woman, very religious. And she certainly didn't appreciate his kind of life. But she cared for people, and Oskar Schindler cared for people. When he realized what was happening, then he was changing. He did not want to be part of it. He knew that for his workers were making him rich. He depended on his workers, and to him, the more Jewish people he applied, the more money he was making, because he only paid like 50 cents for a Jewish worker, but for a Polish worker, he would have to pay $1. I mean, not $1, a zloty. And of course, Oskar Schindler had orders for the guards not to come into the camp and not to come into the factory. All they did was picking us up at the edge of the camp and walked behind us as we walked a few steps practically to the factory. And then every morning when he came, he always patted my head. He said, "We Gates is, you know, a little one." And to us, of course, we worshipped him. In Oskar Schindler's factory, in Oskar Schindler's camp, there were only 2 people that died. And they died by being taken care of in a hospital bed in the basement of the factory, taken care of by Mrs. Schindler. And the Schindlers arranged that those people, one was an older woman and one was a young girl who had cancer. And they arranged for them to be buried in a casket, which didn't happen to millions of others. In places, they were able to come after the war and move them to a Jewish cemetery in Prague. Oskar Schindler is an example that one person can make a difference. That there is always something you can do, because everybody said there was nothing I could do. Yes, there is always something you can do.
Well, unfortunately, in 1944, Renia and her mother and the other workers for Schindler were forced into cattle car trains and taken to Auschwitz concentration camp.
But I remember that we were packed into one of the boxcars. And I want you to imagine a boxcar. You know how big or how small they are? And by that time on the list, there were 300 women. And so we were packed into those 2 boxcars. And I remember we stood like this because we couldn't move. There was no air. There was no bathroom facilities. There was no food. There was no water. And some of the women, after a while, started to faint. And we had no idea where we were going because it didn't look like we were going where we thought we would be going. I remember we tried to find little holes in the wood and try to see. By that time it was getting dark and you couldn't see anywhere. And I remember when the train finally stopped and they opened the door, I remember that the spotlight shone on the train. And I remember seeing like miles and miles of barbed wire, hundreds and hundreds, it seemed to me, soldiers with the dogs. And there was a sign. It said Auschwitz-Birkenau. And then we knew. You know, we have heard about Auschwitz-Birkenau. There were rumors. We didn't believe it. How could you believe it in a 20th century that people would build a place, a special factory for murdering people? It was unthinkable. It was unthinkable then, and it's unthinkable now. You know, Auschwitz was a big camp. There was Auschwitz I, where the Germans kept their prisoners of war, their religious prisoners, political prisoners and others. But it was in Auschwitz-Birkenau, when they built the gas chamber and when they built the crematorium. And it was to Auschwitz-Birkenau where they were bringing all their Jewish slaves, because all the Jews were victims. But there were some victims also that were not Jewish. And I remember we were helped to get out by prisoners. We were helped to jump down from the train, from the boxcar. And we were running. Right away they were yelling, heraus, mach schnell, always beating us with their whips. And we realized it was a terrible stench in Auschwitz. And also we thought it was snowing. It was November, it was fall. Winter comes early to Poland. And so we tried to catch the snowflakes we were so thirsty. And we realized those were no snowflakes, those were ashes. You know, the family of the guards from Auschwitz, who lived not too far from the camp, they used to complain to the visitors from Berlin that they couldn't hang up their laundry and they couldn't let their children play. There was too much ashes. And I remember as we were running, I could see ahead of us, way ahead of us, even though it was midnight, it was dark, you couldn't see. And I remember seeing chimneys. And I remember smoke coming out of chimneys, even though it was dark, and fire. Didn't believe it. Could not believe what it represented. And I remember we finally came to halt in front of a huge barrack. There was a lot of German, well-fed and well-dressed uniform, and one especially with a whip in his hand, saying some women left, right, and we realized those going to the left could barely walk. They were exhausted from the trip, but those going to the right, we started to realize were our women from Schindler's List. We were much better off than any other victims because we came from Oskar Schindler. And I remember we started to pinch our cheeks, you know, so we would look better, and we stood up straight and were pushed into this barrack. We were told to strip from head to bottom. I remember they told us that we had to fold our clothes. There was a bench, like all around the wall, there was a bench, and to put our clothes there. And I was smuggling a picture of my father under my tongue. And I realized that they looked into everybody's mouth to see if maybe people have a gold tooth, then they would pull it. I didn't have any, but still, I took my picture of my father, the only thing I had remaining from my father, and I put it in my shoe. And I remember we were standing in line and we were shaved from head to bottom, and by the other prisoners. And they didn't have, you know, the right instruments. And so they were pulling, you know, our hair and cutting it together with the scalp, and we were crying. And they were saying, don't cry, you don't have nothing to worry about. You're not going to the gas chamber. They are over there, they said, pointing to the other side. And I remember just the way you saw it in a movie when they pushed us into this other room and it was dark. We didn't see, we didn't know what was happening. And we were scared. And all of a sudden the light came on and the water came down. And I looked around. I looked at my mother. I looked at all the friends. I've been working with them for so many years. I didn't recognize anyone. And I said to my mom, well, now we are dead. We have nothing to worry about. They had killed us and it didn't hurt. And my mother said, no, we are not dead. And she touched me, said, we're going to be okay. And I just looked at her and looked at all my friends. And, you know, without our hair, we felt so totally dehumanized, humiliated, traumatized, because all the
My mother also was at Auschwitz. And she told me that when she was sent to Auschwitz on the train platform, when they got out of the boxcar, Dr. Mengele was there, pointing right, pointing left, determining who would live and who would die. My mother's mother was sent to the left, taken to the gas chambers. She was 43 years old, but considered too old to work. Her little brother was 7 years old, also considered too little to work. My mother spoke of how when she saw her mother being taken to the left, how she felt so guilty that she couldn't do anything to help her mom and save her. My mother and her 3 sisters luckily went to the right. They were taken to the showers and water came out, luckily, not the gas that killed her mother. My mom had a needle for sewing, and she knew she needed to keep it because it might help her get extra bread if she could sew something. So she took that needle and she pushed it into a bar of soap. And luckily she was able to save that needle. When she got out of the showers, they quickly rushed them into the other room, like Renia had just said, and quickly they had to grab a dress. There was piles of clothes there, just grab anything you could grab. Pile of shoes. They were told to grab a pile, whatever shoes you can grab. And of course, the dress my mom picked quickly didn't fit her. Of course, the shoes really didn't fit her. So she didn't really have anything warm, and she certainly didn't have anything really that fit her. So anyway, then, like Renia said, she was taken to have herself, she was shaved from head to toe. Now, think about Hitler. Yeah, he was a horrible, evil man. But he also was a smart person who knew how to use psychology. He wanted to humiliate the Jewish people. He wanted to dehumanize the Jewish people. So not only did he have their heads shaved and everywhere else, he also had the barracks, long boards. That was their toilets, a long board with holes in it. And that was their toilets while men were watching, soldiers were watching. Hitler also made sure they didn't have names anymore. He put numbers. My mom had a number on her arm. So now she was just a number. Hitler also wanted the Jewish people to lose any sense of hope. My mom told me a story of how there was this woman who always talked about, oh, my son, the doctor. Oh, I hope you meet my son, the doctor. So wonderful, wonderful stories. Well, the Nazis one day decided to take away all that wonderful, wonderful hope of hers. And they actually came to her with a box and said, this is a box of your son's ashes. Well, actually, he was still alive. And the reason I know that is that after the war, my mother's oldest sister met him and they got married, and actually very happily married with 2 wonderful kids, my cousins. Anyway, so before the war, keep in mind that the German people were just regular people. They were doctors, plumbers, electricians, husbands, sons, fathers, regular people. So it's actually hard to understand, how did these German people who had been respectable, cultured people, law-abiding people, how could they become murderers and killing people and their only crime? They were killing people whose only crime was that they were born Jewish. It's unthinkable then, and it's unthinkable now. In Auschwitz, you had to work hard to produce for the Nazi efforts. Otherwise, you would be shot. My mom had a hard job to do. Now, remember, we're talking about people who are starving and week, my mom's job was to carry a long pole, a telephone pole. She would be at one end, another young person at the other end, and carry what was extremely heavy. Now think about the fact that if you ever had to put a piece of wood into a fireplace, you know that wood is heavy. Okay, and we're talking about two young people who don't have much strength and haven't eaten very much. That's what they had to do to stay alive. My mom used to tell me how, when you need the strength, you find it. And that's how she was able to survive. Well, those were words to me. I know she said that and she meant it, but I didn't truly understand it until one day I was with my friend. She was a professor of mine, a former professor of mine, and she was a big person, probably 250 pounds. And I was the only one with her, and she fell. Now, I knew I had to be the one to pick her up. Now, I don't weigh anywhere near what she weighed, and I had to somehow find the strength to pick up this woman. I found the strength. I was able to put my arm under her armpits and pick her up. And that really showed me what my mom meant. But when you need the strength, you find it. And that's how a lot of survivors were able to manage the hard labor in concentration camp. Well, my mom was one of the four sisters, and the miracle is that all four sisters survived. But they also stayed together, which is also another miracle. But staying together probably helped them survive. They helped each other, so sharing the food, the little bit of food they had. They were able to help each other with moral support. Now, if Hitler knew that these were a family of four sisters, he would surely have broken them up. He didn't want them to have any sense of moral support at all. He knew how breaking people's spirit also helped people to die more quickly. So my mom and her sisters had to be very careful not to let the Nazis know that these were four sisters together. So for instance, when they were online to get their numbers on their arm, numbers that would be sequential, they had to be thinking ahead about what to do so the numbers wouldn't be sequential. My mother's oldest, her sister Erna, took somebody between her and the sisters so the numbers would not be in order. Well, the interesting thing is that many, many years later, after the war, when Erna, the oldest sister, then went to Australia, she wound up meeting somebody and she saw the number on the woman's arm and she realized that woman had a number that was one different from hers. And that was the woman she had put in front of her so she wouldn't be standing next to her sister. Amazing things that happen. Well, after Renia was in Auschwitz for 3.5 weeks, Oskar Schindler found out what had happened. It was not supposed to happen. So what he did is he paid the Auschwitz commandant with a bag of diamonds, and he was able to get Renia and the other workers out of the concentration camp. And when they got back to Schindler's factory, his wife, Mrs. Emily Schindler, nursed them back to health, gave them food, and took care of them. Even though Mr. and Mrs. Schindler had their own villa, do you know that they slept at the factory, not in their own villa every night? They wanted to stay in the factory to protect the workers, to make sure the Nazis wouldn't come in and hurt any of them. Well, my mother's story is very similar to Renia's, except that my mom was not on Schindler's list. So she had to endure being in Auschwitz concentration camp until 1945. In 1945, there was the death march. The Germans knew they were losing the war. They wanted to get rid of all the evidence that was in the concentration camps and get everybody out. So they had the Jewish people that were left there in Auschwitz rush out, taking a long, long march called the Death March through the woods, in the snow, in the cold, knowing that these Jewish people would not survive. Mom was walking with her sisters, and they were walking every day, day in, day out, miles and miles, until they got to a point where they really saw that they were too weak to be able to go on the next day. Well, that night, when they were put into the barn, one of the sisters saw there was a little space under the boardwalk, under the boards of the floor. Okay, so you know how the barns have those boards? Well, there was a space, but I'm talking about a little space. But then again, you have to think about the four sisters who'd been starving all these years. They were skinny and they were determined to survive, though. So here they were. They looked at that little spot and they said, we're going to do it. And they slid under those the floorboards, got in there, had somebody cover them up, back up, put the boards over them, and they laid on their stomachs. And they lay there as still as they could, squeezed themselves together, even though some of them had dysentery. Well, the next morning when the Nazis came to empty out the barn, they had to just stay there and try to hold their breath and not move, just hoping that none of the Nazis would realize they were hiding under the floor. Well, luckily they didn't notice. Luckily, when the Nazis left and took all the other Jewish prisoners with them, they were still alive. And they waited a little bit longer until they made sure everybody was gone. And they got out and realized they had survived another day. And now they would be able to try to find a place to be safe. Well, not that it was easy to be safe afterwards, because it wasn't easy to know where to go after that, but they did survive. Well, finally, the war ended in 1945, and now they have to decide, okay, where do I go? The war's over, but where do I go? That's what they had to figure out. They had no parents, they had no home. Imagine, for 6 years, my mom and her sisters and Renia too. I mean, they suffered. My mom told me how for 6 years they had no home, no food, not really food, as Renia spoke of, no real bed, no parents, and also mainly no freedom, only fear. My mom always talked about how she appreciated being in America. So when it was time for Thanksgiving, that was a very big deal for her. She had a big table, everybody, all the family was there, because to her, she was really, really thankful for the freedom here in this country. When Renia speaks admiringly of Oskar Schindler, she is pointing out how one person could make such a huge difference in the world. She wants us to learn that we can also make a difference, not necessarily on the same scale, not necessarily impacting 1,200 people, but perhaps in our own communities, in our places of work, or in our schools, or in our the states we live in, wherever we see injustice or bullying or prejudice. We make decisions on our own lives when we see someone being bullied, or a disabled person treated with disrespect, or a colored person of color is treated unfairly. Renia strongly believes we must be upstanders, not bystanders, not doing nothing as we watch. 6 million people were killed during the Holocaust. These were families, including women and children. It's not an army. The only reason they were killed was because they were Jewish. The Holocaust was not an accident. Hitler, he used fear. He used promises to promote prejudice and hatred of those who are different. He also used stereotyping of people so they no longer seemed as individuals, but as an unwanted group of people. Hitler knew that the national pride of the German people was strongly hurt when they lost World War I. He also knew that the poor economy there in Germany was also affecting the people of Germany. So he was promising to make Germany strong again. And unfortunately, the Jews were a convenient scapegoat. Scapegoat he could blame for losing the war. A scapegoat he could blame for having a lousy economy at that point. Now, we often hear people say, never again. This is very meaningful to me. It means a lot to me because I see what my mom had gone through. I hear what Renia had gone through. And I also know of all the millions of people who did not survive the Holocaust. However, it also carries meaning to all of us, not just us Jews. It means we must learn the lessons of the past so it doesn't happen again in the present and the future. So please think about what we can learn. Think of the power of prejudice, stereotyping, hatred. Think of the masses in Germany that followed Hitler without thinking for themselves. Think of the power of words and propaganda. Think of all the people and countries that stood by and did nothing. I feel it is really important for me to share my mother's story and Renia's story, especially now when there are people trying to deny it even happened. As years go on, there are less and less survivors to speak out. So I think it's so important for us to understand the effect of hatred, stereotyping, prejudice, scapegoating, following the masses, not thinking for ourselves, or peer pressure. We must understand what this can do to people and to countries. I hope you can help educate others so that these lessons can be learned and not forgotten. And remember that one person can make a difference. Yes, you can make a difference, and hopefully we can say never again. Thank you very much.
Now, before we move on to questions, we do actually have some additional videos from Renia prepared for today. So we gave her some questions that we anticipated that you guys would probably have, and she was able to answer them via video for you all. All right. So here's Aunt Renia, just a couple of days ago.
Did you get to talk to Oskar or Amelia Schindler after the war?
I never saw Oskar Schindler after the war,
But Amelia,
but I saw Amelia a couple of times when she was invited by the Holocaust survivors in Florida.
And another.
with the rise of hatred in the world now, what can people do to help make it a better world?
People, first of all, should remember what hatred has done so many years ago, and how much it could help if they stopped hating each other, how much good they could do by admiring or advising other people to behave and to be kind.
So that is my Aunt Renia. So she's an amazing Schindler's List survivor, amazing Holocaust survivor. As you can hear, our relatives are incredible Holocaust survivors, but they're also just great people. And one of the things that growing up has always stood out to me is how they're not bitter. They're very kind, loving people. And especially my grandmother, she growing up would often, my mom always tells the stories about how she would tell about what happened during the Holocaust, often talking about how absurd some of the situations were, sometimes even laughing to the point of how the absurdity, drinking soup out of a hole in her shoe. And
And telling it while she'd be laughing.
With tears coming down her cheeks.
Laughter.
So you can get a sense of their personalities. And a couple other things also I wanted to share before we move on to questions is, so you might notice that on Renia's book, that her name is spelled R-E-N-A, like Rena, and she is also called Rena in many places, whereas we call her Renia. And so a lot of our family, a lot of our relatives have their name that they from Europe, their Jewish, I guess Jewish, Yiddish, European name, like Renia, or like my grandmother, it's Gija. Whereas they also, when they came to America, they developed that they basically got more Americanized names. So my grandmother went by Mary, which is very unlike Gija, and Renia goes by Rena instead of Renia here as in a more Americanized version. But to me, she's Renia. So, but that's where you'll notice that spelling difference. And the other thing I also just wanted to, I'm sure people are probably wondering is, so after the war, Renia basically, she was able to get papers. Well, first she actually met Mark, who she married, wonderful, wonderful man, who became her husband. She was able to get sponsored and able to get papers, so she's able to come to Massachusetts here in the US. And she basically, she went on to have 3 children, and then she has gone on to have now, and then she went on to have many grandchildren and now great-grandchildren. She has 7 great-grandchildren now. And she has done lots and lots of speaking. And she is one of those people who is just so sweet, so kind, and is also very, very known for her incredible brownies. So as you can see, this is a picture of Renia with her 2 daughters. And also she's done lots of speaking engagements ever since the 1980s. She's been speaking at schools, at the UN, speaking in all different platforms, at colleges, speaking in every opportunity possible. She also, this is a picture of her with Liam Neeson at one of the premieres, I guess, for Schindler's List. And also another photo with Steven Spielberg back in 2014, I believe it was, when she was a speaker at the United Nations Holocaust Memorial Ceremony along with Steven Spielberg. So as you can tell, she's very dedicated to making sure that people remember about what happened during the Holocaust. And that was something where initially she, thought about, should I be continuing to talk about this? But then when she realized that there were people that were actually denying that the Holocaust even existed, she realized that it was her obligation, and she felt the importance of telling people about what happened. And what's amazing is that she has truly committed herself, and she shared her story with so many different audiences. And when you visit her home, you can see all the thank you notes because she's touched so many lives. And my grandmother, she married my grandfather David, and then they came to New York, actually. Both Renia and my grandmother both came by steamship. They both came by boat. And my grandmother came to New York. She continued to sew long throughout her life. She actually sewed for a lot of our family gatherings. And if you look at most of the weddings, a lot of the times all the family were dressed up. Most of the gowns my grandmother made. She would always make all the gowns for everyone. My grandmother went on, she had 2 children, my mom and her sister Eleanor, and she's had, grandchildren and now great-grandchildren. But unfortunately, my grandmother, she developed Alzheimer's very early at age 60, attributed to the head trauma. So, but my grandmother definitely influenced my life because she was just so loving, even though she was nonverbal. And to me, that actually was a big part of why I went into medicine, actually. So at this point, I appreciate all you guys paying attention and all your focus. But at this point, we want to open it up and hear what questions you all have. So I'd love to open up the chat, and feel free to unmute yourselves. We'd love to hear from you as well. So feel free to unmute or write it in the chat, either way, and just let us know what questions you have. All right.
I want to thank you all. I'm so glad that you all are here so we could share with you. Just want you to know that. And I'm looking forward to any questions you might have about my mother or Renia, about the war experience, or before the war, after the war, during the war. I also think it's wonderful that you are taking the interest to learn about something that really is not such a distant historical event, if you think about it. So
I have a question.
Sure.
Whether the family members who survived spoke openly about their experiences in the years after the war, or did it take essentially a couple of decades before people began to explain their experiences and find an audience who was interested and willing to hear about those experiences?
I'd like to do
I'd
that.
be glad to answer that one. Hey, there's my cousin Vivian. Okay. Actually, I would also give a chance for my cousin to respond to that too in a second. My mom spoke about it to the family, to me. I learned about it in the kitchen table, at the kitchen table talking, but not publicly was she talking about it. My father, we couldn't even talk about it even at home. He couldn't deal with any of it. All I remember is him waking up in the middle of the night with nightmares. When he came home, if there was any TV show that had to do with any of the war or anything, shut the TV off. Even if my mother was wearing red, it upset him because of the sight of blood to him. So my father was totally closed about it. What was interesting is one day when one of my daughters had to do a project to find out about family history. Well, I had to do it because I had to go down to Florida. I left Connecticut, went to Florida, interviewed him for my daughter's project. And I told him, look, right off the bat, I'm going to tape you, but when all I want to know is about before the war and how your home life was. I'm not going to ask you about the war because I know you don't want to talk about that. So as soon as I got to the point where we finished talking about his life before the war, I was going to shut off the tape recorder. He said, no, I want to talk about the war. And that was when he was about 75 years old. So it did take him decades, just as you had mentioned, yes. Now, one of my mother's sister, Erna, the older sister, that was a different story. And Vivian, Erna's daughter, is right here. I wasn't sure if you wanted to address how your mom dealt with it.
Sure, if you don't mind. Hi, everyone. This is a great presentation. Thank you for inviting me. And a very good question, because my mother was I also had two opposite. My mother was very outspoken and she taught classes but at the beginning, and she wrote books, which I happen to have here. She wrote 2 books, which I happen to have right here because I'm doing some project with them. Because it's my legacy and it's been passed down. But at the beginning, my mother tried to speak and she said that people didn't want to hear it. They said, oh yes, we suffered too. We had the Great Depression and nobody wanted to hear about it. And it was very difficult at the beginning. But more and more, she started to speak in classrooms, in schools, in synagogue, churches, and the university. She worked at Syracuse University. Her first book came out in 1984. It took many years and many rejection letters, but finally it was published, and about 8 years later, the second book came out. Yes, and my father, the same thing. If we asked him anything about it, you could see the tears well up in his eyes. He couldn't speak about it. So I had the 2 opposite extremes in my house, but my mother was very outspoken and always wanted to teach the world not to hate, that this is the result and this is what happens and there's a better way. And she did all her life. Thank you, Rach.
Thank you, Vivian.
Devorah, there's a few questions in the chat that I just wanted to bring up in case you didn't see it. I'm just going to read all 3 of them and then I'll let you respond.
I just want to mention one other thing first, if that's okay. And I also thought that along the lines of Aunt Erna writing that book, what I always found striking is that what I always recall hearing was that part of that process of writing the book was also really therapeutic for her, I thought. Was that my understanding was that it was also part of her way of kind of processing everything and kind of working through some of the trauma and everything that she was dealing with, which I mean, we often hear about, journaling and things like that, but for it to then turn into a book, which for future generations has honestly become one of our most prized possessions. Like, as unfortunately, my Aunt Erna is, and my grandmother and my grandfather, they're no longer with us anymore. So those books that we have, the 2 books from Aunt Erna and now Aunt Renia's books, honestly are the most important things that our family has, and especially the most important things to pass down to my nieces, my nephew. So that's where it's just so special.
So we thank Vivian's mother for
Very
having written
much.
those wonderful books to give us our family history.
Correct.
The history before the war, during the war, and after the war.
Yeah.
Anyway, there was another question.
Yep.
Oh, yeah. So here's 3 questions that were in the chat. One is, how do you think the bitterness was avoided? Like you mentioned, I admire that very much. That's from Marty. The second is, thank you for sharing. We're so grateful. I'm curious how this journey has impacted you as 2nd and 3rd generation survivors. And the third one is, what is something you want teenagers learning about the Holocaust in school to know, specifically about descendants of survivors?
Excellent questions. So I think in terms of the bitterness, honestly, that is one of the things that I always am impressed by, because they went through so much, and the fact that, I mean, they're so loving and so kind, and really like they haven't, I, that always amazed me. What do you think?
Yeah, amazing.
Any?
I don't know. I mean, I always think of a story that totally surprised me when I think about how my parents didn't have any bitterness. There was a time when my dad was in the hospital, and I knew that he was sharing a room with another man, and the other man happened to be somebody with a strong German accent. And so my initial reaction was, I'm going to walk into that hospital room and I wonder what the tension's going to be between my dad and this man who's got the strong German accent who's laying down on the bed next to him. What was amazing is when I walked into that hospital room, my dad says, "Hi, honey, I want to introduce you to my friend so-and-so." So yeah, I don't know how, but I do know that somehow they were able to move forward.
Yeah.
Should we go to the next question?
Yeah.
How is it impacted? Well, in terms of myself, in my home, it was different for me and different for my sister. I grew up feeling like I knew something and understood something, a deeper sense of understanding that my peers could not have or understand. And so it made me feel not privileged, that's not the word, but feel that I had gained something from hearing the stories in a certain way. It gave me a maturity that I felt I'd gained from my family stories. Where my sister, totally opposite. I think she felt more uncomfortable, that it made her feel different.
As a 3rd generation, I guess I would say for me, it often is a matter of perspective. So one of the things that I kind of struggle with is many times when I'm in a situation with a lot of stress, dealing with a certain challenge, I often think back to, you know, my relatives went through so much and they kept pushing, they were so strong. And I come from such strong women, such strong people, such a strong family that, you know, I can kind of do this. I can do anything. But I think one of the challenges I've always had is that it's hard to sometimes compare and be like, you know, why am I getting stressed by this when, you know, they went through so much worse? And so that trap I've often had to fight, because of course my relatives, they would never want me to compare, because it's 2 totally different lives and scenarios. But I think the biggest thing is perspective, and just that feeling of strength and resilience, knowing that you come from a family where there is that perspective of just that you can, when you need that strength, you can find it. And I feel like that's a big part of what I think about, is that when I need to do something, I can do it. Like med school, it was so hard. And residency, I mean, I don't know how I did all that when I did, but I did it and I loved it. And so, and I feel like the thing that I also actually, I mean, probably how it's impacted me the most is actually probably the lessons that I've grown up with, where, I mean, it's funny how I still, if I ever use that word hate, my mind immediately cringes. Like I think like, wait, like substitute for dislike, substitute for something else, because it's just such an extreme word. And I have these certain things in my mind that are just where, you know, try not to waste food, trying not to, just being aware of standing up for other people whenever I can, and, making sure to do my part. Um, and, and so I feel like that's played a lot into how I live my life, and it's definitely impacted things. And I appreciate the fact that I've grown up with a lot of those lessons.
I see that my cousin Vivian.
Thank you, Vivian.
Yes, I see somebody has asked for the title of your book.
And I see Viv just actually popped it in. It's called The Survivor in Us All, is the first one. And that book is about the experiences of my grandmother and her 4 sisters during the war. And then the second one, called After the Holocaust, The Long Road to Freedom, is basically has a summary of their experiences during the war. And then it describes kind of how to rebuild life and their whole path after the war. And it's by Erna Rubinstein. You can find them on Amazon. It's no longer being published, but you can definitely find used copies on Amazon, and also a lot of copies in libraries, because we've tried to do as much as possible whenever we pass out copies, encourage people to pass them along to other people after reading, or donate copies to the libraries. So.
Then there's another question about what do we think specifically the teenagers should learn about the descendants of the survivors. I guess that would be us.
Yeah.
Personally, I do feel like my parents did not want us to feel guilty. They wanted us to feel proud about Judaism. I think they wanted us to know that they were willing to do all they could to survive because they valued their Judaism and their heritage. Back to what Devorah was saying, is to learn that when you really want to do something, you can, if you give it your all and you try your best.
And remembering that it happened, that there is all the fact that there are deniers out there right now is absolutely horrific and should not be, and that all of us learning about the Holocaust, we need to speak up. If you hear about someone saying something otherwise, don't just ignore it. It is our responsibility to speak up, to actually say something and tell and continue to teach other people about what happened.
I'd like to address one of the other questions about someone whose parents were also survivors, but I understand you don't know very much about your parents. I will tell you that I'm fortunate, of course, because Vivian's mother wrote this book. I'm fortunate because my mom told me stories, but I do also know that there are actually places in Europe, depending where your parents came from, there are some places, some town halls in some of the big cities in Germany, for instance, that have records. You'd be amazed at the records they have. They even have records of, I know for myself, they even have records of where my mom was, what concentration camp she was, or my father, and what year he was there. Yeah. I mean, the German people kept such accurate records. Surprisingly, if you try to get in touch with some of these town hall type of places in Europe, it's amazing what you can find.
There's I forget the name of it. We can actually look it up, and I can, when we send out the link afterwards, we can include that information in that email if you'd like. But there is a website where if you're looking for information about a relative who was somewhere probably during the Holocaust or something like that, you can put in their information and it'll send you any records that are available. And what's interesting is actually mom on her dad's side, you recently actually learned about a relative. So there was someone on your dad's side who did that service where he did that records request to try to figure out more about his family, and ended up realizing that he's related to us.
And now I know I have more relatives
on your dad's side. And so, but it's amazing that he sent you like things like marriage certificates and photos of this and that, and the records that are out there are incredible.
Well, I want us to just be able to end saying thank you so much for all of you being here, and I'm really appreciative. To me, it's really important that we're able to share this.
Yeah,
And
I just
know-
wanted to say thank you so much to Devorah and Rachel for really going above and beyond to tell your side of the stories, your family members' side of the stories. Renia is like really honoring her words by sharing videos, even though she wasn't able to be with us today. And I think whether this is the first survivor story you've heard or the 1000th survivor story you've heard, they're all so important and so unique. So just thank you for everyone for being with us, and really thank you, Devorah and Rachel, for sharing so much of yourselves and your family with us. Really appreciate it. And we will send out the recording, we'll send out the video links, we'll send out the book titles. So again, thank you so much for being with us today. And have a good rest of the day.
Bye.
Thank you all very much. Have a great day.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, and thank you for that message. Thank you.
Devorah, open up the chat. There's a lot of messages.
Great job, guys. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you. Love you.
That was a great that your cousin was able to come on and share like that.
Wonderful.
It's like a family reunion.
Best. And I also saw that she posted that the books are being republished, which is, I didn't know that. That's incredible.
That's great. That's great. People are still thanking you in the chat. This is really nice.
Oh, Renia.
Did some of the survivors stay in Germany after the war? Or did they all pretty much leave?
Our family all left, but I'm sure in other families there are some that left that stayed, but our family all came to either the US or to Israel.
Did they eventually go back to visit, or no, they never went back after?
Some did.
Right.
One of our cousins went back. And so there are photos of him going back to the concentration camps and how incredibly hard that was. But we actually had a cousin where my mom and her generation and a bunch of the cousins, they all went back to kind of retrace the steps of our family.
I had